Let's begin this show about the year 1982 by acknowledging two major blunders in two previous shows. One was the omission of Beneath Apple Manor, an Apple II game developed by Don Wirth in 1978. It is notable for being a PC dungeon crawling game that came out before the likes of Rogue or Ultima. It is in fact the first commercial PC RPG, not Rogue, and one of the first ones on the PC to use random room generation. You could argue that the roguelike genre owes as much of its existence to Beneath Apple Manor as it does to Rogue, but considering how obscure the game is, that is a bit doubtful. The second glaring and absolutely unforgivable mistake was forgetting about Mystery House. In fact, I have not even mentioned the founding of Sierra Online in the show so far, which is in itself a really bad thing. I haven't mentioned Activision either, but we'll get to them today. Mystery House was among the first adventure games to have a graphical representation. You no longer relied just on the text to understand the environment you were in. This was a big change. It was a resounding success that allowed Roberta and Ken Williams to build adventure games and basically create the genre as we know it today. I apologize deeply for not including it in the 1980 Game show, which was 2 weeks ago. Mistakes will happen, and since published shows can be modified, they will forever remain as a black mark on the series until the inevitable 7-hour complete edition of this series sometime next year. I know that either me or someone that's very obsessed with the show will make it. I'm hoping it's gonna be you. That being said, let's move on to 1982, the year of Michael Jackson's Thriller, the year that Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan gave people a glance at what CGI could do, with ILM's beautiful representation of what the effect of the Genesis program would be on a planet. This was the year that Tron was released, fueling the desire of people to one day venture into cyberspace, the year of the Falkland Islands War, and the year in which China passed 1 billion people. Two of the most popular computer systems ever made were released this year. The Commodore 64, which would go on to become the best-selling computer of all time. And by that I mean that no other computer of a single specification has sold more. Yes, Apple sells a lot of computers, HP sells a lot of computers, Dell sells a lot of computers, but they don't all sell the exact same machine. The Commodore 64, however, defined a decade, at least in the US, because in Europe we had the Sinclair Research ZX Spectrum, a cheap as hell and endlessly cloned system that could potentially turn any teenager with some time on their hands and enough dedication into a game developer worth millions. To many, these systems are the ones that truly launched the home computing era, even though the likes of the Apple II and the Atari 8-bit computers would still be popular in their own right. The Atari series actually got a sort of a new version in the form of the Atari 5200, which was literally an Atari 400, I believe, without a keyboard. But it was marketed as a home console, not a computer, and it didn't really do as well commercially as the Atari 2600. 1982 is also notable for a few companies being founded, like Sun Microsystems, Adobe Systems, while on the gaming side of things, Trip Hawkins, a former employee of Apple, founded Electronic Arts and filled it with talent from all the major tech companies of the age. He even got Steve Wozniak to be on the board of directors. EA, I believe, did not release any games in that year, but soon it would, and it would start doing shitty things as well, but that's a matter for a show of its own one day. That very same year, a guy named Bill and another guy named Sid came together to found a company they called Microprose, that within a decade would rob you of your sleep and worry your loved ones that you always say just one more turn and never actually leave your computer. More on that in about 2 months. One of the most successful games to come out in 1982 was the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man. Even though it sold over 7 million copies, it was an absolute pile of crap compared to the original, and it highlighted a very serious problem. Within just 5 years, Atari went from creating games that were interesting in spite of the limitations of the technology of the time, to creating outright pieces of garbage in the sense that they just threw them into landfills by the millions. And no, I'm not talking specifically about E.T. the Extraterrestrial that was made by Howard Scott Warshaw in just a few weeks. As bad as E.T. was, it was only the tip of the iceberg. An iceberg made of garbage that would soon be buried in a landfill. That's because Atari had a structure that didn't differentiate between the people that were making games and the people that were doing smaller tasks that, let's face it, packaging isn't really at the same level as programming. So, as the legend goes, in 1979, 4 of its programmers and game designers, David Crane, Larry Kaplan, Alan Miller, and Bob Whitehead, went to the CEO of the company, which was then Ray Kassar, and asked for their names on the box and to be paid royalties for the games they were making from scratch and pretty much entirely. There was no real concept of a team back then, with thousands of employees. And in case you're wondering, Nolan Bushnell had been forced out of the company for many years by then, and Kassar said no. So the 4 quit and founded their own company. Initially it was to be called V-Sync Inc., but when that didn't fit, they went with a portmanteau of Active Television, Activision, the first third-party game developer for a home console. Up until then, there were no companies outside of the manufacturer of the console that made games for that console. On the computer side of things, of course, things were open, but tight control was exerted on consoles, and in Atari's case, it led to laziness and many horrible games, not an increase in quality. They were the only one making the games. After all, there was no competition. At some point, they just didn't care. Regardless of what you may think of the current form of Activision, its existence extended the life of the Atari 2600 by a few years. It had released a few games that I glossed over in the past 2 years, but in 1982, it released some of the greatest games on the platform. Pitfall became an instant classic, a platformer that further helped shape and define what this genre could be. Activision also released River Raid, Carol Shaw's scrolling shoot-'em-up that went above and beyond the Space Invaders formula by actually making the player move towards the enemy, requiring refueling and going around obstacles in order to succeed. It sold over 1 million copies, and from my own personal experience of having played these games when I was a kid, River Raid was a shining gem in the mire of shovelware that Atari was peddling in that age. Activision broke the mold and inspired many others to create their own Atari 2600 games, which is how we got third-party publishers. That's how the gaming industry moved beyond one company ruling one platform, at least on the console side. That's how we got Parker Brothers' The Empire Strikes Back, an adaptation of sorts of the hot battle scene from the second Star Wars movie. That was the first Star Wars game. Wasn't great compared to River Raid, but it wasn't awful either. Not completely awful. Coming back to Sierra Online, not only did the company continue releasing graphical adventure games like Time Zone, which was a globe-trotting, time-traveling, puzzle-filled marvel of its age with over 1,300 individual locations, all graphically represented, and a text parser that could understand commands made up of even 2 words. But the company also went on to publish Richard Garriott's Ultima 2 that very same year, and there was some dispute about it, which led to the 2 parts parting ways and never working again together. FS1 Flight Simulator was transformed into Microsoft Flight Simulator by being ported to PC-DOS and licensed to Microsoft, and in the process it became one of the go-to benchmark for testing that a system that was supposed to be a clone of an IBM PC conform to the standard as much as possible. It was notable also for running within its own operating system, being totally independent from any software present on the PC. Sublogic itself would continue to develop the non-Microsoft version of the game for several more years. On the arcade front, things were still going strong. Namco released the beloved Dig Dug, a game about digging yourself into a hole and probably dying there. A developer called Gotileb released another popular mascot-driven game called Qbert, the main character being famous for its tendency to swear a lot in an unintelligible fashion. Tron itself came to the arcades in the form of an adaptation that set a standard of quality to which some say that other adaptations have not really been able to top yet. The game offered a succession of separate individual challenges, like the iconic light cycle battles that entertain people even now, 37 years later. Oh sure, now it is a mode for GTA 5 instead of its own game, but it is still quite enjoyable. Sega released Zaxxon, one of the first games to use an isometric perspective in order to give the 2D graphics of the game a sense of a third dimension, a method that stuck around for decades due to its low impact on hardware compared to actual 3D and greater visual quality compared to early blocky 3D. And I can't pass up mentioning Miss Pac-Man as well, a sequel to the classic that Midway made without actually getting permission from Namco, which had its own planned out series for Pac-Man. Even so, it proved to be very successful, iterating upon the initial game, changing actually very little, but refining enough so that the end result would keep people coming back again and again. As for what the game of 1982 was, well, I've gotta give it to E.T. the Extraterrestrial. This is not a joke. It's not just about what was the best game of that year or what game innovated the most. It's the game that best represented that year, and E.T. was just that. A rushed, hastily put together, barely tested, somewhat incoherent mess. That was the state of the home console market, at least in the US. That was the perceived state of the video game industry at large. That is what E.T. embodied. Even though, truth be told, there were worse games on the Atari 2600 than E.T. At least Howard Scott Warshaw tried to be creative. The game would go on to be a resounding failure, Atari being forced to destroy and bury the unsold copies that numbered in the millions. The company's hubris got the best of it, believing that anything it put out, especially based on a beloved recent movie, would be an instant success. Boy, were they wrong. And we will see the fallout of this event next week. Goodbye.